Hi, and welcome to the second season podcast. My name is Jagger,
And I'm Robin.
and today we're going to be discussing the Golden State Warriors and Jonathan Kuminga.
Over the summer, we heard constantly the kind of back and forth between Kuminga's agent and the Golden State Warriors as to how their contract negotiations were going. And eventually they came to a deal at 2 years, 46.8 million and a team option on the second year. This contract was pretty clearly designed to be traded, but with the profound improvement from Jonathan Kuminga so far this year, how are we looking now? And I think to begin to answer that question, we have to kind of really figure out what the Warriors are right now and how they're playing, how Kuminga fits into that. So I think to start, we're going to talk about a bit about how the Warriors are looking right now, kind of where we're at, what they're doing, what the overall situation is for the Warriors.
Yeah, and if you're talking about the Golden State Warriors, everything starts at Steph at the top and then trickles down to Draymond and Jimmy. That's their core right now. Those three players who are both, or all three, comfortably very much so in their mid 30s. So we've both agreed this is a 2 year, very hard timeline with how their contracts are aligned right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because all three of those contracts come off the books in the 27 summer. And it's not only do those three contracts come off the books, pretty much everyone is off the books. The Warriors have, I think, a total of three contracts currently that would even extend past that. And
Who are those players?
those three players are Moses Moody, Buddy Hield, who is non guaranteed in that year, and Will Richard, who is also non guaranteed in that year.
Yeah, so 2 year timeline.
And then it's looking like it's going to be a hard reset for the Warriors. So they have these last 2 years, and it's looking like it's going to be this kind of three-man core of Curry, Butler, and Draymond. How far do we think that core can grow? How far do we think that core can go? What is there like? Do they look like a team that can actually compete? Is this just kind of playing out the ends of those three players' careers, or can they actually be a threat in the playoffs this year?
Yeah, so using any historical data with players that are this old is very finicky because we know how fast players can fall off in the NBA once you get into that mid 30s range. But I mean, last year they were, I believe, the number one defense in the NBA after they acquired Jimmy. So that ceiling is there. And then having Steph Curry on your team is always going to give you a very, very high ceiling on offense as well. So if those indicators continue to hold up into this season and into the 26 playoffs, I feel very good about them being a contending team in that top five, top six team in the NBA range. How do you feel?
I think they definitely have a lot of potential to kind of get to that level. I think so far this season, Curry has looked really good. I think he's playing really well. I think he's, as good as ever. However, I think the kind of periphery parts outside of those three have not quite lived up to what they need to be for that team to really kind of reach that point. The new signing of Al Horford has not looked so great so far. He's coming off the bench, not playing back to backs, which is, pretty expected at this point, but it still hasn't been kind of the big piece to kind of unlock things that everyone kind of expected it to be. Additionally, there is this kind of 4 or 5 man guard quintet around Curry, and figuring out which of those players are actually going to be playable in the playoffs and actually going to really help the Warriors win at the highest levels, I think is kind of the big question for what this team will end up looking like outside of the Kuminga situation.
Yeah, I think to start, we should really hammer in on Al so far. Very early season as far from a sample size standpoint, but this looks like it might be the beginning of the end for Al Horford as a very effective high level basketball player. 21 minutes a game. Like you said, he's not playing back to backs. He's down to under 6 points a game now. So the usage rate is really, really plummeting into that like single digit PJ Tucker zone, which is never a good sign for any player. It puts a lot of pressure on your defense and your spot up shooting, which we know Al Horford can do, but the Warriors signed him for all his other ancillary skills as well, right? Being that veteran defensive presence that's versatile, switchable even at age 39.
I mean, that's the one that stood out to me the most is kind of seeing him on these switches. And when he does have to kind of defend on an island in the last few seconds of a shot clock, it has not looked good. He's getting blown by. He's getting kind of put into the mix in a way that he hasn't been able to kind of use his size and length to kind of contain the way he has the past few years in Boston, it's been much more of a hopefully this guy doesn't just blow right past me and then there's some help behind me. But I think the issue there is what kind of groups can the Warriors actually put together on the floor when they get to these like high level minutes. And I think most people wouldn't expect it to. I mean, most people expect it's going to be Draymond closing at the five, but I think it's become very clear that Steve Kerr doesn't want to play Draymond. Doesn't want to start Draymond at the five, and they've had kind of the emergence of Quentin Post has helped with that, but I still think they're like what they envisioned as having this kind of like incredible defensive group with the spacing and shooting from Al Horford. I have a lot of concerns if that's actually going to work in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think it really might be a wait and see thing, which is going to be a theme for this entire team. They're so old. It's more or less an exercise in us predicting like what their health probability is going to be come April and May.
I think it's very true, but it's also kind of become just how the NBA playoffs are a lot of the time at this point is kind of just survival of the healthiest or, healthiest team wins. And I think if we kind of remove that layer and just take these players, let's like assuming everyone is at their healthiest, I think the Warriors are very, very close, but not quite there when it comes to kind of having to compete with OKC in particular. I see a lot of ways that would be a like difficult matchup for them. Whereas kind of the other big teams that I can think of in the West are, Denver. I think they actually match up pretty well with Denver, but
Historically,
yeah,
yes.
historically
Steph
they've matched up well.
with Jokic is usually not a good matchup for Denver.
And I mean, on top of that, like I think the Rockets would be an interesting matchup, and I think that's actually a matchup where Al Horford could still be like pretty useful and pretty helpful.
I think I would agree with that. Even if his athleticism might be fully zapped at this point, he still is what 6'9", 250, and we know what type of physical bodies the Rockets are going to throw out into the floor. So he could be useful in that matchup. I agree.
And the other thing that we touched on a little bit earlier was this kind of guard quintet outside of, and we're gonna get to Kuminga. That is a big piece. That is the piece to move. But
We're calling this the non-Kuminga supporting cast right here.
I think it's really important to have a like near perfect, as best of a possible understanding that you can of what is surrounding the Warriors and what the Warriors are when we're trying to evaluate what they can do with Kuminga. Is it worth it to keep him? Is it worth it to trade him? So I think figuring out what this kind of guard quintet outside of Curry of Buddy Hield, Brandon Pajemski, Gary Payton, DeAnthony Melton, Moses Moody, which of those players are going to kind of come out to the forefront and be the ones that actually have big minutes in the playoffs, especially because a lot of those players have different strengths and weaknesses. Some of them we haven't even seen play much yet this season. Some are getting kind of old. Some are still very young and improving. Which of those five do you see as the ones to kind of take the reins and like be really playing meaningful big minutes in the playoffs?
Well, I think the dream for the Warriors is D'Anthony Melton being healthy, right? Continuing the theme. He's shown in his career to be a high-level defensive guard and also having the ability to hit shots. Very, very valuable things to have as a role player, especially around these aging players. If he still has any sense of athleticism, he's struggled a lot with injuries. But yeah, being a high-level defensive guard that can hit shots, that's kind of the crux of it for the Warriors when you're surrounding these older players.
Yeah, I mean he's only played 44 games in the past 2 seasons. So even outside of getting him actually back on the floor, what we have to kind of guess and kind of predict how we think he's actually going to perform. Like, is he still a valuable player? Like, is he still good enough to play? Or have these injuries kind of sapped the athleticism and mobility that he needs to have to really be a productive defender? I'm not that worried about his like level of intelligence on the floor, and I think that's something we really want to focus on here is that the Warriors do really, really well with intelligent defenders and intelligent offensive basketball players, just intelligent basketball players in any sense of the word. Finding people that kind of can easily fit into their systems, both offensively and defensively, that require a lot of decision making, and finding players that can really that do well in that kind of environment and thrive, going off of the kind of semi-random movement and kind of little constant movement, especially kind of using the gravity of Curry to kind of find openings everywhere they go. Finding players that can make best use of that is what's going to eventually decide who's going to be on the floor.
Yeah, I think the Warriors, they embody kind of the point 0.5 basketball mentality, right? Where it's constantly making quick decisions, just a stream of small, quick decisions over and over again on the court. And I think kind of segueing to the next player in this quintet that we have, I think Brandon Pajemski is a guy that I believe Steve Kerr would want to kind of take that spot as the guard position.
Yeah, I think he's kind of the first stop and the first check in for that, especially as the having had such a good rookie season and kind of coming into his own last season. And I think that is like if he was the kind of like the everything that people actually or like wanted him to be, I think that would work really well. But I have a lot of concerns about his shot creation and his ability to actually kind of take those like half advantages where he's not like fully just completely blown past his guy, but where he still needs to kind of make one more kind of finishing move to get to the basket or get to a clean jumper. I'm a little concerned if he can actually do that at a high enough level to really be what the Warriors need. He's not the kind of dynamic off-ball shooter that Jordan Poole was, and I don't think he's really I don't think he's athletic enough or has enough of a kind of like crafty finishing package to actually make use of the space created for him by Steph Curry.
Yeah, I echo almost all of that. I would describe it as he just doesn't have quite enough wiggle, like you said, in those half advantages to get by his defender, which really fizzles out an offense when you're forced to almost restart again. He does have that small, quick intelligence, though, that we were talking about, the ability to find open cuts, cutting players, Steph sneaking open off of a flare screen. I think those are things that make him very valuable. But like you said, he's a step below from an athletic and physical standpoint. And offensively, if he's not hitting shots or finding quick passes as a connector, there just isn't a lot there right now.
I think the kind of pinnacle example, or like best example of this that I can think of is a lot of time when he kind of drives to the basket, he's not getting these easy, clean layups. It turns into these kind of like stop, pivot back, floaters, kind of over contest. And I think
they look talented when they go in, but it's just not efficient offense.
Yeah, and I think he's quite good at those shots, and he makes them at a rate that is better than I think you would expect from the average kind of like low end starter, high end backup kind of position. But it's not going to cut it as like the backup point guard or kind of secondary ball handler for the Warriors in the playoffs.
Yeah, I would agree.
And so if it's not going to be Pajemski, who do you go to next? Or if it's not going to be Pajemski and we don't really know what's up with Melton, who do we go to next? We have Buddy Hield, who's obviously an unbelievable shooter, and I think is one of the players that is going to very easily finding minutes kind of next to two guards and him with Buddy at the 3, especially during like the regular season. But as we get to the playoffs, is he able to survive on defense?
No. Buddy Hield is one of the best shooters of all time. That's more or less a fact, but he has a lot of other deficiencies from a defensive intensity and also physicality standpoint. And then from a decision-making standpoint, he's almost the antithesis to what we're talking about here with that Warrior system. He's very slow to make decisions, and oftentimes his decisions are, let's just say, not the best ones. So I think for him to be the level of shooter that he is, but still struggle to find minutes, I think that says a lot about his ancillary skills just not being at the level that they need to be. And he's a veteran at this point in his 30s, so we can't really expect much improvement there.
I think he's definitely going to have minutes in the playoffs just because his shooting is so kind of valuable and so elite, especially when Curry's off the floor. But I do think that when you do have him on the floor, you need to kind of surround him with a lot of really good decision makers that can kind of take the burden off of him and make sure that he only has to focus on being like the last spot for the shot, right? Like that's all he has to worry about is kind of move himself around, get open, and then take the shot. And he doesn't have to worry about making kind of secondary decisions or, once he is driving, he'll make one decent read, but that's about it. And I think kind of the bigger concern for me, honestly, is if he has to be your kind of like primary or secondary on-ball defender, I think that could become flammable really quickly.
Yeah, I think flammable on both sides of the ball, both in the positive and negative sense, really apply to Buddy. He's a spot minute guy in the playoffs to me, unless he really, really has it going. So yeah, and then the next or one of the last two guys here, GP2, kind of the other end of that spectrum, one of the best defensive specialists in the NBA for a couple years now. How do you still feel about where he's at athletically?
I think he's definitely taken a step back as a defender. And on top of that, I think he's taken a even larger step back as an offensive player. I think he's pretty much relegated to kind of that short roll or dunker spot. And at this point, is that even a very like how effective is he in those situations? Like
Exactly.
how good of a finisher he used to be like an unbelievable finisher, right? Like you could no worries get him in that kind of like old fashioned Iguodala spot where like he can just rise up and throw down the lob on a short roll from Draymond. But I think those days might be behind us. And while he definitely has kind of all those ancillary skills and like really knows this Warrior system and has been very effective in it and can really capitalize off of that kind of cutting and movement and quick screens for Curry and kind of off ball cuts to the basket when Curry's kind of flaring off of him or
Yeah, him kind of as a mini Draymond. They definitely have not quite the same synergy, obviously, but he is able to fill that role to some degree at least.
and if he is in that kind of situation, if he's healthy enough, which we haven't really seen, has he played at all this season? I don't know if he's played a single minute this season so far.
I don't think so. No,
So
if he has, it's been very
yeah,
minimal.
so it's a big question mark, and the most recent indicators were kind of, oh, this could be kind of cooked, this could be over. So I think relying on him is very nerve wracking, and I think it's going to be limited to pretty much, holy crap, we need someone to slow down this, Shea for a little bit just to throw something else at him because right now he's just absolutely cooking us. That's when GP2 it might be useful, but I don't think you can really rely on him as a every down 25 to 30 minutes a night.
No, yeah, age 33 season for Gary Payton II, and he is playing this season 8 minutes a game. So very, very minimized role right now, which maybe he's just on the Al Horford plan, right? Just get him to April and May healthy, and then we're good. But you just never know. When this guy's getting their mid-30s again, the cliff comes really quickly, especially for guys who are relying on athleticism, and Gary Payton is arguably one of the most athleticism reliant players in the NBA. So
the final option here is Moses Moody, who I think does a lot of these things kind of like close to good enough.
Similar to Pods, he's one of the most jack of all tradesy guys here.
I think he's definitely a more. I trust Moody. I think I like. That's a really close call, but I think I like Moody's defense better than I like Pajemski's, and
more length, arguably less athleticism. It's a trade off there.
He at least has like a fair bit of strength and heft to him that he's not going to just get pushed around. He's a strong rebounder and is I would say, a much better like catch and go, like catch it as a spot up guy and then drive to the basket guy than Pajemski is, even if he can't make the same sort of, fancy moves off those situations.
He can get to the rim.
He can get to the rim, and that kind of like hard driving style, I think, is something that has worked well for the Warriors in the past with, again, Iguodala or Gary Payton in the past, or
just taking advantage of the advantages that Steph is going to create for these players.
But again, maybe not quite the shooter that you want, maybe not the defender that you want at that position. So you have a lot of kind of options that fill different bars to different varying amounts, and finding the right one for the right situation, I think, will often be how this Warriors lineup and how this team kind of handles itself in the playoffs. So I think we could see pretty big variances on minutes, game to game, and series to series once we get to the playoffs. But I think the thing that we can say about pretty much all of these guys is that if you have to guard Luka Doncic or Kevin Durant or any of these kind of like big wing ball handlers,
Anthony Edwards.
Anthony Edwards.
If we're talking about the West here,
yeah, even Shea. Like I think Shea's a little skinnier, so they might have, but he's also unbelievable, so it's a little tricky there. They don't really have someone who I would feel comfortable putting on those guys, except for
one Jonathan Kuminga.
So now on to Kuminga. What what were your kind of thoughts coming into the season? What did you expect? What did you want to see? How has that played out so far?
Yeah, so for Jonathan Kuminga, age 23 season, this is his fifth season now. And he's shown growth in some areas throughout his career in terms of moving the ball, passing the ball. But we can both agree that's his biggest weakness as a player. Is just some people would call it selfish, other players would call it a Kobe mentality where he's going to get his shots up regardless of what's going on around him. And in this Warrior system, that's a massive deficiency, right? There's advantages being created to get to the rim or find open threes, and he's taking turnaround middies with 15 on the shot clock. So that's been kind of my overview of Kuminga from a decision making standpoint. Obviously, one of the best athletes in the NBA, an incredible talent in terms of ball handling, scoring ability. We have both agreed over the years that he would be an incredible bad team, great box score stats guy. We also agree that doesn't really drive winning. So those are my kind of initial thoughts coming into the season. How are you feeling about Kuminga?
Yeah, coming into the season, that's about where I landed. I thought, doesn't really have the kind of isn't quite good enough at his big skill was kind of getting to the line, getting fouled, but he wanted to the way he played was a bit more like, oh, I'm going to use my athleticism to kind of get to jumpers, and those never really went in. I think while that isn't exactly the ideal skill set to put next to Curry, I think having having a player who can get to shots and kind of use that, especially when Curry is being kind of like fully like you're playing 4-on-4 essentially, having a kind of like bigger wing or someone who can get to shots and kind of have some shot creation is very valuable next to Curry. And we've seen that with, the classic one was Kevin Durant, obviously nowhere near that, but even Andrew Wiggins does have like a fair amount of shot creation in his skill set, even if those shots, whether or not how valuable it is kind of entirely depended on how much those shots went in. Having I think that shot creation, even if it wasn't always perfectly executed and he didn't always kind of get to the exactly what you wanted him to get to, when you'd much rather have him like using his athleticism to just drive hard and get fouled, like that's when it looked at its best. And I think that is a very valuable skill set to have next to Steph Curry if you can channel it in the right ways. And I think the big problem was how he channeled his skills and like where he applied himself. And I think we've seen steps in the right direction so far this year.
Yeah, I would agree. Just touching on what you said about having secondary creation next to Steph, we can really go in the time machine. And a player like Sean Livingston and even early Iguodala, players that did have the ball in their hands with Steph on the floor, it does take advantage of Steph's incredible otherworldly off-ball ability and creation. And also scalability isn't necessarily this dichotomous thing where it's like, unless you're a three-point shooter and a defensive player, you just can't be on the floor next to stars. Secondary creation, we talk about all the time. It's really important. Second side offense, when the ball swings to you, the ability to make a read or take advantage of the micro advantage created by the stars. Like we were talking about pods, the ability to finish off of that little mini advantage. And Kuminga has that. But as we know, when you're fitting next to stars, those other skills are very important: shooting, defense, and decision making. So I think that takes us into this season where we've seen a really, really big leap with Kuminga in terms of his passing and just winning plays in general.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly true so far. We've seen him kind of fill much more seamlessly into that role of the like the classic Warriors set where, you have your three or whichever kind of attacking wing you have posted up in the high post, and then you run Curry off of a flare from Draymond, and then Draymond can either cut to the basket or you let that if the other defenders kind of jump at Curry, it gives that posted up wing kind of an opportunity to attack. We've seen him fit into that role really seamlessly this year, or at least maybe not really seamlessly, but
I think he's
seamlessly
willing
than it has to.
He's
in the past.
willing
Yeah.
to make those reads, right? These aren't necessarily on the fly. Should I shoot or should I pass? But he's in a position where he is the passing hub, right? And he's making these passes, which is a big deal for Jonathan Kuminga. We just have not seen that so far in his career.
Yeah, especially out of the post so far this year, he has looked much more. he's able to kind of take a second, scan, see what's happening before he kind of just immediately gets into his bag.
Absolutely.
And I think that is a huge step in the right direction for him, because even as a like once he gets moving and gets into his offense, the kind of mentality of like, hey, there are other things going on, I think even it is trickled into that as well. Him coming off of screens for someone like Quentin Post, who is just an incredible shooter, has been, I think I can count back the number of times this in like the past couple of games that I've watched where he comes off a wing ball screen and can just immediately like he puts pressure on the rim, turns and just fires a pass straight to Quentin Post, who's wide open for a three.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, those are huge improvements from him, and it's seeing that kind of evolution and growth is, I think, made what was clearly the original plan of sign Kuminga to this contract that has a ton of team control and then trade him a much more complicated decision.
It does, yes. I think that segues us into what we believe to be Kuminga's biggest asset for this Warriors team, and that's his defense, right? The ability to truly guard 1 through 4 off of the tip, right off the bat. And not just 1 through 4 in a general sense of you feel okay about him on these players, but the stars that we mentioned earlier, Luka, Anthony Edwards, Shea, you feel really good about Kuminga on these guys with his rare combination of size, athleticism, length, of course. We saw over the years how important Clay was as this lock and trail, kind of set it and forget it wing defender. And that's really been missing for the Warriors. We saw it a little bit with Wiggins, but we agree he just wasn't quite on that same level in terms of athleticism. Maybe you disagree there?
Well, I think I disagree there. I think Wiggins, when he was with the Warriors, was one of the best wing defenders in the league. I think that put him in a position where not only could he use, I mean, Wiggins is an unbelievable athlete. He may not be quite as, at that point, quite as explosive as Kuminga is right now, but he was also a solid chunk older than Kuminga is right now. And whether or not Kuminga is as good as Wiggins was in those situations, I think is less important than is Kuminga capable of providing that level of like, this is our guy that we're going to put on the best guy. He can take care of that. He's not going to shut him down because obviously these guys are too good to be completely shut down. But at least he's not going to get like physically overwhelmed. And if they just try to take him in a straight ISO, half the time he'll make it a slightly difficult shot.
At minimum, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we're on the same page there. And this is invaluable to the Warriors because that famous guard quintet that we mentioned earlier, none of these players have that skill set.
We have a situation now where Kuminga has improved offensively. I still think we should probably touch on a couple of the downsides of Kuminga here. Is he is not a shooter.
Yeah.
He is a bad shooter. He does not space the floor. He may take some. He doesn't really hit them. And once you get to the playoffs, I think teams are going to feel very comfortable putting their centers on a number of different players on this team and being able to put intelligent help defending guards, which there are a number of in the Western Conference, or help defending forwards onto these guys and letting them kind of roam freely. I think it's going to be really problematic for the Warriors if you have like Jabari Smith Jr. just like camped out on Jonathan Kuminga or Jimmy Butler, and then there's another I guess actually for the Warrior, let's go through the Rocket situation. So you'll have Şengün predominantly on, or Draymond, right? Like that'll be kind of like the big crunch time closing lineup if they're not going with a double big look. But I think we'll see how that works. I think that'll be a punch they throw.
Warriors on offense right now.
Okay, so Warriors on offense. You're probably put Jabari on Draymond. I don't know if I want Şengün involved in all those screening actions, at which point you can put Şengün on Kuminga and he can just vibe out and chill.
That forces Kuminga into running the actions with whoever's on ball, right? Steph or Jimmy.
Yeah. Let alone you having Kevin Durant on Jimmy at that point, which I don't know if I would want to do that either. I think this is going to be one where you're going to see them kind of switch around a lot, but they're always going to have at least one person who is not hyper involved in the action that is able to kind of help and make things difficult and be at the rim. And kind of the big thing that we've discovered in the past few years that really kind of can mess up the offense the offense for the Warriors is a bunch of rim protection.
Rim protection and length, yes.
Yeah. And if so you'd have a man on Curry that's a tough matchup, right? Like that's, if anyone's going to make it hard
That's a lot of length, man.
If anyone's going to make it hard on Curry, it's going to be a man. And at that point, we're getting like there's just a ton of length and a ton of freedom to help off of people. I think that could be a really tough offensive environment for the Warriors.
Yeah, I think the larger point that we were trying to make here, which is why circling all the way back, like Al Horford signing that was so vital to this team, is having shooting at those forward and center positions is a really big deal because we know Jimmy has his deficiencies, right? And then like if you're gonna have Kuminga out there
and
Draymond, there's just a lot. We've seen the Warriors squeak by for over a decade now with shooting deficiencies because of Steph's ability to create shots at the 3-point line, opening up the rim. There's only so much you can do that though.
Especially because in a lot of those years, they had like the second or third best shooter of all time right next to him, right?
In a much lower offensive environment in general. So there's a lot of things pushing against the Warriors here, which is why Kuminga as a shooter is something we're going to really focus on and hammer in, especially as we talk about alternatives eventually. Shooting at this position is really, really invaluable.
Yeah, we saw like kind of the best Warriors teams had one of the greatest shooting forwards ever next to him, right? And obviously we're not going to create that, and this has to be a different team than those teams were. But I think there is despite all the improvements from Kuminga as an offensive player, that big deficiency is, I think, ultimately what you kind of need. Like that big deficiency, and whether or not you can find a way to fill that is kind of the big decision point, and what would have a kind of like profound impact on how the Warriors do in the playoffs this season.
Exactly, yeah. But as we'll discuss, those alternatives also have trade-offs themselves, which makes this a very interesting conversation.
The last thing, as we're kind of talking about off-ball defense for a second, one of the big criticisms, or one of the things that we see in the Warriors system is that they do a lot of kind of peel switching. It's a very, it's a defensive system that requires a fair bit of intelligence, or enough intelligence to kind of operate as that extended version of Draymond Green, who can use his little joystick to move around Andrew Wiggins.
Shout out JaVale McGee.
Yeah, shout out JaVale McGee. Has Kuminga improved enough as a kind of off-ball and help and team defender to get this defense to a good enough point that his offensive drawbacks are worth it?
That's the question, right? I would argue that as a team defender, no, but that's the beauty of his role with this team right now as the set it and forget it 1 through 4, lock and trail, guard this guy. We'll take care of everything behind you. Just don't let this guy get a good shot or create a good shot for his teammates. I do not trust him as a Draymond light on the back line, rather making calls, reads on defense.
I don't think he needs to operate as that. I think he just needs to be able to recognize the matchups. Like he needs to be either, and I think we've seen that a couple times this season. I remember there was very famously from one of their games against the Nuggets, where on like the last possession, Curry gets switched onto Jokic, and Kuminga immediately scram switches him out. And I think that's about the most you need from him right now. I
think that's all you can ask.
Yeah,
that's about what you can ask.
That's about what you need from him. So I think he has improved on that front, but it's not. I don't think it's ever going to be like some preternational. This is like an all defense guy. I think it's going to be we feel safe with this guy guarding the best player on another team, and it's not going to be like a joke.
100% agree. He wouldn't be getting any all defense votes from us, but I can imagine people will watch highlights or whatever, and yeah, this is a high level 1-on-1 defender, which we can argue about its value in the broader defensive sense, but for this Warriors team, that's what they need, right?
And whenever you're kind of evaluating a player like this, and you're evaluating like kind of, I mean, Kuminga is the big piece that the Warriors still have to move to try to improve this team for the next kind of like, they have all their draft picks, and he is the kind of big matching salary contract. And when you're evaluating that as a trade piece, it's really important to have a good understanding of what that contract is. Is it like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of that contract? How much, like, kind of, what kind of situations or things do you have to consider when you're dealing with this contract? And as we said earlier, 2 years, $46.8 million, and a team option on that second year for $24.3 million. How do you view Kuminga player plus contract? How fairly do you think he's paid? How do you see his next contract going?
Yeah, so I think coming into the season, my thought would be at its absolute best, at Kuminga's best, this contract would be a neutral, maybe. Now I feel with what we've seen so far, neutral might be the floor for this contract, given that he does have a talent level that is valuable in this league, right? The ability to, we talk about all the time, the ability to create valuable shots for yourself and others is a skill. How good he is at that skill is one thing, but he has that baseline. And then some of the scalable skills that we're talking about, the passing and the defense, improving as well. He might not ever be the level of shooter, but it's 22 million, not 35 million or 40 plus million or even 50 million, right? Mm-hmm. 22 million this day and age is starting level player, right?
Yeah, I think it's comfortably your fourth or third most, like, highest paid player. And I think there are definitely teams in this league that would bring him in to be a, like, I think you can envision now, after these steps, a kind of continued path of improvement that takes him to being a, like, your third best or second best player on a good team, especially if you're a team that has, like, good shooting at the 4 and the 5, or the, at the 5 especially, where he can kind of really take a bunch of space and attack. And actually, something I wanted to touch on a little bit earlier was his value to the Warriors offensively, and how that kind of should I talk about this earlier?
We can touch on it now.
Yeah, we can just touch on it now.
His physicality.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about how he's looked as kind of a shot creator this year when he's getting to his own offense. And I think this actually works right now, because it'll be more important for whichever team he gets traded to, if he gets traded.
Correct.
One spot where I've really seen the Warriors look for for Kuminga, is in those kind of semi-transition early offense positions, especially against a slightly scrambled defense. They will look to get him the ball either on the wing or at the top, and just let him attack once hard and see what happens. What happens. And I think that has been I think it's something that if you watch their games, you can really see the emphasis on that. You'll see Curry throw him the ball just to go attack some, and it's not even like, they're not even going after, like, oh, he has, the 1 on them or the 5 on them, and someone he can totally toast. They'll even let him go after people that are kind of roughly the same size as him, and just let him attack. And I think what that shows is kind of a trust that he's not just going to go to those, like, turnaround jumpers anymore, and that he'll attack. Okay, if I've got something, great. And if I don't have something, then I can bring it back out, and we can use that kind of, like, pressure for a second to kind of get into the next set of actions or whatever. And I think that emphasis has really, I think you can see the kind of thought process of, like, hey, we need to let him kind of explore a little bit, but also, like, this is something that's, like, we trust him now enough to kind of make that move and still bring it back out. And I think I actually do worry a little bit what would happen to the Warriors offense if they lost that wrinkle.
Yeah. I have examples flying through my head right now what you're talking about. I think even this season, it's the exact example you're talking about. He semi-transition, 18 on the shot clock or so.
I mean, we've seen the rate at which people are crossing half court has, like, shot up. And so, like, some of these attacks are happening with, like, 21 on the shot clock, 20 on the shot clock, really, really early.
Which is crazy to say semi-transition, but yeah, like, they'll see Austin Reeves or something is on him. Someone like that, where he has a clear physical advantage. And like you said, can I get to a good shot? If not, great. We still have, 17, 16 on the shot clock. That's very viable. You mentioned how replaceable this skill is. They do have Jimmy Butler on the roster still, which in theory, this is his domain, right? the ability to use his guile and whatever sense of athleticism he has left, physicality to get to these semi-transition flips and hooks,
I
fouls. Yeah,
I don't think we've seen that from him this season, and I don't think it's really part of his game anymore. I really think the Warriors without Kuminga don't really have someone besides, I guess, Draymond. If he can get back to that kind of like shove it down your throat really quickly off the when he's not really looking for a shot, he's gonna shove it up, like shove it down your throat, get to like the dotted line, and then turn around and pass to Curry.
yeah, the Ben Simmons offense.
Yeah, but back okay now. That's kind of like that's I think an interesting to touch on is that like where can that go for another team, right? Where can this offense? Is there more to explore? Is him? We touched on Quentin Post for a second. Like if you can put him in more of a what would be a good example? Like him in like the Jalen Johnson role, where he's this like big forward ball handler next to a shooting big. What does that look like? Is that something that like is that worth exploring? Can he get to where Jalen Johnson seems to be headed as potentially even like the second best player in an offense, like on a good team?
Yeah, we've seen examples. I think this kind of starts and ends with Giannis is this kind of downhill driver that has shooting deficiencies, but the ball is going to be in his hands and he's going to be running the show. And we've seen how powerful that is with 4-out spacing, and that like we see it now with the Magic. Even they're trying this with 2 players, right? That are going to have the ball in their hands and create from there with less than ideal jump shot abilities. And I think Kuminga definitely has the athletic baseline and skill level to do this. It's just the other things that we talked about, the overall decision making that holds him back. But we've seen like even this summer before this relative leap from him from a decision making and passing standpoint, seems like the Suns and the Kings, they were willing to trade for him. There were restricted free agency reasons why these trades didn't happen, with compensation being involved, but these are teams that clearly value what Jonathan Kuminga was as a lower level player in our eyes. And so I believe a market is there. If that's what we're circling all the way back to with his current contract, yes.
So now we can get into other teams here. So the crux of the decision becomes: is there a player that the Warriors can trade for that gives them a better chance in this playoffs and the next playoffs to really like be really really good? Is there a player they can trade Jonathan Kuminga for that really dramatically improves their chances in the next 2 playoffs?
Yeah, this is just based on how trades in the NBA work. This is most likely going to be a talent reduction, but an increase in fit in terms of whatever players or player that the Warriors are getting back in this. So it's their front office making the evaluation that as talented as Kuminga is right now, and the growth, even with the growth that he's shown, there are potential alternatives that give us a higher chance of winning at the highest levels. And that's kind of all you're doing and all you're worried about at this point, right? Is just maximizing those championship percentage points with Steph, Jimmy, and Dre. So that's priority number 1. So now that we've laid out what the Warriors are and what Kuminga is as a player, we want to discuss the Warriors' biggest priority right now, which is, of course, these 2 years being their championship window. So the discussion becomes, are there potential alternatives to fill this Jonathan Kuminga, not only salary slot, but also skill set slot that maximize any percentage points of an increase in championship equity for the Warriors? And we've gone through a league-wide evaluation of player contracts, player skill sets, also opposing teams' potential willingness to trade for Kuminga and part ways with current players that they have. And we've boiled down our analysis to 2 potential players that possibly could fit this ideal role for the Warriors from a skill set standpoint, but also, of course, we have to consider the salary as well. So who are these 2 players that we have?
The 2 players that we've kind of come to the conclusion that kind of fit into this role and are on teams that might want Kuminga as a player plus contract and have the skill set that the Warriors are really looking for are Dillon Brooks and Jeremy Grant. I think we're going to dive into Dillon Brooks first, kind of look at the contract situation, look at the player, see what it's going to look like for the Suns going forward, and see what it looks like for the Warriors going forward before we kind of talk about a little bit of the kind of shooting and athleticism and kind of how these new players would fit into the Warriors. So for Dylan Brooks,
I think before we start, it's good to preface that kind of the main skills that we're gonna prioritize here for these alternatives are shooting, right? Catch and shoot shooting, overall fit into the Warriors-ness system, intelligence, passing, defensive switchability, scrams. We can go over it all.
Mhm.
And then that coveted 1 through 4 ability to guard bigger players, guards,
guard the best player on the other team.
best player on the other team, to put it simply. And so, yeah, Jeremy and Dylan are 2 players that we targeted having the ability to potentially fill these roles for the Warriors. And yeah, we'll start with Dylan, like you said.
So Dylan has approximately 2 years and 41-ish million left on his contract. He's ever so slightly cheaper than, or he's on an ever so slightly cheaper contract than Jonathan Kuminga, which means very critically though, his contract at least this year and next year is less than the Warriors. So when they trade for him, they still have space underneath their second apron hard cap to kind of fill out their roster with most likely Seth Curry at this point. And the Suns are in it essentially it the slight increase for the Suns. They have enough space under their first apron hard cap, or no, underneath the tax, to be totally fine. Let me double check that. Yes, they are. Well, they can make secondary. We can make a secondary move. They would make a secondary move to kind of still get themselves out of the tax, whether that be moving on from whoever could it be, Royce O'Neal or whatever. There's plenty of ways for the Suns to still get out of the tax while taking on Jonathan Kuminga.
Yes. So essentially, this works from a cap standpoint, right? And this is not a Suns podcast. We won't go into the nitty gritty detail of would they or would they not do this. But just going off of their very, very strong interest over the summer and their position as a team right now, we both find it very plausible that they would consider this trade, right? From the standpoint of player plus contract.
I think it's really easy to see that. They're in a very kind of weird situation they've looked relatively good this year, but also don't really have a clear vision of the future. And so kind of just bring in a sheer talent upgrade, especially a young talent upgrade, I think would make a lot of sense for them. And just to touch back on the cap stuff, they are very clearly at some point going to make a move that gets them out of the tax, because right now they're like 500,000 to the tax or something like that. And the additional $1.4-ish million would already be covered by taking out by like any move that they would make to get out of the tax already can essentially also be used to get out of the tax once they've acquired Kuminga. So I think it's a pretty clear sell as to why the Suns would do this. I think the Warriors would prefer to not. I think the Warriors would go in saying that like Jonathan Kuminga is the whole value, but if you're the Warriors and it takes whatever it takes, and you're committed to trying to maximize this time right now, whether it's a first right now or a swap, or I think I think we can circle back to that once we have a better understanding of what Dylan Brooks is.
Yeah.
So
with fake trades, there's always the machinations with pick protections and assets, minor variance, who values who a little bit more, a little bit less. Our goal here is, right, the thought experiment of Dylan Brooks is fit on the Warriors instead of Kuminga. So we can start with that coveted defensive ability to guard the other team's best players. How do you feel about that for him right now?
I think Dylan Brooks still looks like one of the best kind of wing forward defenders. It's especially as a perimeter option in the league. I think he hasn't really lost much since last year, and I think he would be a pretty significant upgrade defensively over Kuminga.
Okay. How do you feel about his definite deficiencies relative to Kuminga in terms of athleticism and length?
They're a little bit worse. He's definitely a worse athlete, especially at this point where he's nearly 30, turns 30 in a few months. I think it's a slight step back, but I still think the kind of technique side and the just guile on that front is more than enough, especially as someone, especially like navigating screens or having to switch onto kind of big forwards or having to switch in pick and roll if you're, if you're dealing with like a Luca, or maybe not Luca's not a great example. If you're dealing with like a Jamal Murray, uh,
We saw it the other night
Jokic
with
pick and
Harden.
roll, I think you're totally fine just like switching that back and forth. Whoever is guarding Jamal Murray, be it D'Anthony Melton or whoever, like, or if he's because he would be guarding Jamal Murray, whoever's guarding Jokic. There you go. If it's Al Horford or if it's Draymond Green, you're fine switching Dylan Brooks onto Jokic and not being like this isn't like a huge panic
It's not
situation,
a
right?
five. Maybe it's like a 3 alarm fire. It's not a 5 alarm fire, right?
It's not a total disaster yet.
Exactly.
Whereas I think if Kuminga gets switched onto Jokic, I would be in. I don't think that's somewhere that I would feel very comfortable at all.
Yeah. I think they would feel switching Dylan Brooks for Kuminga on this Warriors team. It would fill a similar role, but he'd do it slightly differently, right? Like you said, it's the guile, it's the strength. He's gonna get into a little more physically. Of course, there's gonna be maybe words involved. Knowing Dylan Brooks, I think I would agree though. Yeah, even with the length and athleticism downgrade, I would say at the very least it would come out to a wash in terms of defensive impact, which is it's very high, right? It's a very important role for the Warriors as we talked about. So now let's talk about one of the second pillars of this player type for the Warriors, and that's shooting. So we both agree that Dylan Brooks would be a likely to very likely shooting upgrade over Kuminga, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty comfortable to say that he takes more, makes more, especially, last year or so far this year it hasn't looked great, but he's also taking way more than
which we've seen as a pattern for Dylan Brooks throughout his career. His percentage will go down as his volume increases.
Yeah, if he's just a catch and shoot guy, I think you're feeling very comfortable with him as a like mid to high 30s shooter on 6 attempts a game, somewhere around there. And I think that kind of bears out over what we saw when he was on kind of like a really good competing team. 23-24, it was 36% on 6 a game. 24-25, it was like 40% on 7 a game, which I think we'll find a balance between those two, maybe slightly leaning towards the 36. So I think you could expect him to come in and be, a 36% shooter, which is a huge improvement
over Jonathan Kuminga, who last year he was 5 per game on 30%. So that's a big improvement, not only in like the raw efficiency of that shot being taken, but obviously how the defense defends you. As we know, that's almost more important than if the shot goes in or not. It's how is the defense reacting to you when the ball is swung to you.
Yeah, and I think I also think not just as an on-ball guy, but when the switches come, I think I see a lot more just kind of awareness and intelligence of like how to switch into scrams, how to scram into things.
On Brooks as a defender, right?
Yeah, with Brooks as a defender, I just see a much higher, like if they were to bring in Brooks and you have this lineup of Curry, Brooks, Draymond, Jimmy, and then either one of the guards or one of the centers. I think like I can very clearly see a like really elite defense, especially if like GP2 comes back and is like, or GP2 or Melton come back and look like healthy and good. I think that could be a really, really good defense.
Yeah, part of the Warriors fit discussion that we're having is this overall guile and veterosity that Dylan Brooks and also Jeremy Grant would bring that Kuminga just doesn't quite have yet, right? He's still relatively young, and there's just a lot of tricks in the NBA, especially with defense, that players pick up over the years. So, yes. I think also another interesting point to touch on, because we talked about it with Kuminga, is that semi-transition ability to see a mismatch, or maybe even not quite a mismatch, but a slight advantage in the ability to attack that. I think Dylan Brooks, we both agree, has that ability, right?
Yeah, I think it might be a slight downgrade from where Kuminga's at, but I do think it's still something that he's very capable of, if not quite as effectively. And whether or not that ends up being I don't think that'll be like the downgrade you get there is as bad as like the upgrade you get defensively.
Okay, yeah. So marginal loss there, but
the shooting and the better defense, I think you could very easily argue make up for it.
Okay, yeah. So continuing to talk about this and flesh this out, it seems not quite a no-brainer for the Warriors to do, but a very, very interesting option to look at, right?
And at that point, it becomes about what you have to give. Like, do you have to give anything besides Kuminga? Is Kuminga enough value for the Suns to just be like, okay, we'll swap? Or is it going to cost a first? Is it going to cost a like heavily protected first? Is it going to cost a first like way out in the future? Can you do it with a couple of seconds? I think that's
A deeper discussion might be outside the scope of this podcast, but
well, I think it is important for the discussion here because the Warriors are very clearly going for, hey, we have 2 years, we have all of our picks. And I mean,
that's what I'm kind of baking in, that they're just not quite willing to fire these into the sun, but it's almost a funny money thing. Like, okay, 2035 first, like sure. Like if that's what it needs to get done.
I don't think that's how the Warriors are viewing it anymore.
Okay.
I think they really, especially because they have all their picks, I think they'd be fine using their pick this year, and I think they might be fine using their pick next year. But after that, I think they do want to go into a rebuild. Like I think that's about what they see as like, hey, we've lined up everything that year, that summer. We can take on some bad contracts. That summer of before the 27-28 season, we can take on some bad contracts. We can really like get into a rebuild and try to see what the next era of Warriors basketball is going to be. And I mean, I think that's why the Kuminga contract goes there too. It lets them kind of that's another decision point for them where like, hey, is Kuminga actually like a valuable player, or can we sign or like valuable player for us? Like, do we want to keep him and kind of build around him in the future, or are we going to sign and trade him that summer?
Okay. Yeah, that's all a great point. Yeah, I think that's just another variable of this that we have to think about, and we will weigh it much more heavily at the end, is if Kuminga just might be the better option here. We can discuss that more after.
Yeah. Let's move on to our second option, which is Jeremy Grant, who this is a little bit more tricky on the cap front. It is going to require require two other players at least to move out from the Warriors. I think ideally for them, it would be Buddy Hield and then one of their minimum guys going out. And Buddy Hield and the minimum guy would likely be rerouted to a third team. The Nets are kind of the cap space dumping ground for things like this. And I think, with a second or two, you can make that happen pretty easily. I don't think that's that big of an impediment. And then the Warriors can fill out their roster with kind of prorated minimums the rest of season contracts. But his contract does go out does go past that 2-year window. He does have a player option there. Whether or not, like, I could totally see a world where he doesn't take that, or where like I think he's almost assuredly going to pick up that player option, and I don't think that really matters to the Warriors. I don't think the Warriors should be like concerned with that. They would still have, at least under now, only like $53 million of cap space signed up in that season with 3 players. Like they've got all the space in the world that they would need, and obviously some of that space will be taken up by first round picks and new players coming in the next 2 seasons. But like there is a added cost to going after Jeremy Grant, and to determine how valuable it is. What do you think of Jeremy Grant? Like, what do you think of Jeremy Grant in this position?
Well, if we're just comparing him to Brooks directly, they again would fill the similar role, but very differently. I think Jeremy Grant, as we talk about Brooks being maybe a marginal to slightly marginal upgrade as a pure shooter over Kuminga, I think we can comfortably say he would be a very large upgrade over Kuminga. Jeremy Grant's shooting numbers over the last couple seasons, we've seen throughout his career as well, he's a high 30s, comfortably high 30s three-point shooter on 6 to 7 attempts per game, which is very, very good from that position. Do you think, though, that shooting upgrade makes up for what we both think is a pretty sizable defense, maybe not sizable, but a deficient defensive and athleticism trade-off?
I think this one really comes down to he's I think a noticeably less set it and forget it defender than
I think
Kuminga
especially on
Brooks,
smaller players, right?
Especially, critically on smaller players. However, what's important to remember is that of that kind of quintet of guards we spoke about earlier, the ones coming back are these 2 potential like really strong defensive guards in DeAnthony Melton and Gary Payton II. If those 2 come back, and most obviously this move would definitely have to take place at pretty much at the trade deadline. If those two come back and look, or at least especially Melton when he comes back and is healthy, if he looks like he can be your go-to guy on guards, then I think this option becomes much more enticing.
It does. You are making the kind of one player for two players trade, which is always tricky because then you're throwing in another injury risk in there, especially with Gary Payton and D'Anthony. We talked about very high injury risk players.
Especially because you're going to have to move on from most likely either Moses Moody or Buddy Hield when you make this trade. So you're giving up a lot of, you're giving up some of your outs, some other outs for other positions.
Exactly. There's
so
depth trade-offs.
Yeah, there's some depth trade-offs with this one. But I do think this one, if D'Anthony Melton comes back, especially D'Anthony Melton, like I don't think I really have much faith in GP2. I would not bet anything on that. But with D'Anthony Melton, if he comes back and is healthy and can be that, we'll guard the smaller guys, you guard the bigger guys, then I think the option of Jeremy Grant becomes very interesting because his offense is so much more developed and fits, I think, very well with the Warriors system and Curry. And we've seen him kind of operate in offenses that have him be involved in a lot of movement and a lot of kind of cutting off the ball and shooting. And I think the offensive upgrade there could be really big.
I think we've talked about that vaunted Andrew Wiggins role, and he would be the closest thing to that, right? Based on what's available realistically for the Warriors right now. Yeah, just that overall fit, right? From a off-ball standpoint, even some on-ball things, right? Second side, advantage creation. He doesn't have the first step that he had when he was younger. He's in his 30s now, but he still has the length to overpower smaller players and also get around bigger, slower players.
And that's on top of a pretty profound shooting upgrade, especially if he's going to be in a situation where he is just being kind of spoon-fed wide open threes when teams help off of him.
Exactly, yeah. Just again on these very offensively deficient Trailblazers teams over the last couple years, he's at 39% on 6 attempts per game from three. That would likely go up.
Yeah, that would fit really well. Additionally, I think defensively he does have, which I think Brooks does too. They both kind of do things that Kuminga doesn't as a kind of help defender. And I think I don't know how comfortable I am saying Jeremy Grant's rim protection is really doing much anymore, but I do think him as a help defender and him kind of operating in a more in a system where there's more movement off ball as a defender and more kind of, you need to be aware of everything else that's going on.
Recognizing actions off ball.
Recognizing actions off ball, and kind of, I think I trust both Dylan and Grant or Jeremy as a pretty significant upgrade over Kuminga.
Right. Yeah. Just a level of, again, veteranosity that is required to thrive in this Warrior system where quick decisions are constantly being made and less of Steve Kerr telling you what to do and more figured out on the floor as actions are happening, right? Offensively and defensively.
Another kind of aspect of this is that while Brooks is a slight downgrade in athleticism and kind of overall just youthfulness and the ability to kind of really, as we've seen in the NBA this year, is there is a lot of kind of push of just playing hard constantly. And
Jeremy's getting kind of creaky.
Jeremy's a little creaky. Not that Kuminga is always the most fiery, up-tempo guy, but at least he has the ability to.
He's still 23, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Grant has the ability to. Brooks, I think I think that's fine. I think he might even be a more, I think I could see him playing way harder than Kuminga. I'm not worried about him. But with Grant, it is a bit of there is a question mark. Are we going to be losing something by kind of losing that just hard ability to play harder? And
I mean, we can hit it on again, just how old the Warriors are. I think it especially matters for them if you're going to have all five, almost your 7-man rotation is this mid to high 30s retirement home, right? We can talk about how smart and how quick they can make decisions all day, but basketball is becoming increasingly, especially in the playoffs, effort-based, youth athleticism. We've seen, of course, with the Pacers, they're pioneered pressuring. Just effort in general is becoming more and more of a differentiator in the playoffs. And would that just catch up to the Warriors if they had all these really old dudes out there?
I think that is something that you have to be pretty concerned about and really think about, and whether or not if you do make this move for Grant, like does that become kind of do you just kind of get run out of the room, especially because with the Grant trade you are giving up some more depth. Like you probably do have to give up a real player that is currently in your rotation. Whether or not they're like how much they're in your rotation in the playoffs might go down a little bit, but they're still going to be in your rotation almost assuredly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from there we can kind of go to, do either of these trades make sense for the Warriors? And then I think we can also slightly touch on if it makes sense for the other team as well. And
Yeah,
like how much the Warriors would have to pay for this to make sense for the other teams.
I think we can just start with the Blazers since
Mhm.
we went through it with the Suns as well. Similar situation, right? From a team standpoint, where they have some talent, but clearly not enough right now to win at the highest levels. So Kuminga for Jeremy Grant makes a lot of sense just on that simple premise.
I don't think it's quite as like seamless of a fit because they do have Tamani Kamara and Denny Avdia, who I would view as just kind of they all kind of have to play similar positions, especially because the shooting from all three of those guys isn't exactly where you want it. And so at that point, the spacing get kind of hard. Who's going to the bench? Who's gonna actually be there? Like I think they want all of those players to be there, but I do think you could also run some very interesting lineups with just all three of those guys as your 3 through 5, and then whichever guards you're playing at that point, be it Scoot coming back and being okay, Shaden Sharp, and the resurgent
Drew.
Drew Holiday, yeah. So I think there is some kind of sense to it, but I also think if I were the Blazers, I mean, I think you do this just for like a sheer value standpoint for the Blazers, where it's like Jeremy Grant, like, okay, he helps us win right now, but we also like we've looked good so far, but
Wins right now, but what does that mean,
yeah,
right?
like what does
Play
that
in?
mean?
Okay.
Like,
All
does that
right.
really help us like actually get to the
Exactly.
playoffs again, or like even be relevant in the playoffs
But
again?
we've seen how this, realistically speaking, how this works in the NBA, where there's the good vibe season after a couple years of tanking. Teams are hesitant to sell high on these role players, right? They ride them out to
Hmm.
the, at best, like seventh or eighth seed.
Yeah. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for the Blazers to like sell high while he looks really good, right? Like get sell high. I mean, I guess then it comes down to like if you were the Warriors, would you give up a first this year, or would you do this trade? Like, would you do this trade at all, even flat? Like just pretty much just the players and just let's put the actual thing out there of like Kuminga, Buddy Hield, and uh, Guy Santos going out, and you get back Jeremy Grant.
That is, it's really really hard, man. I think these trade offs that we've weighed here from the shooting and athleticism and decision making standpoint, um, yeah, I think both sides have merit, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we can agree on that. I think though, if you're going to that gun to the head gut reaction, I think I would make that trade for the Warriors. I think it, again, all we're thinking about right now is boosting those little percentage odds of championship equity, and I think that does that.
Now the next question is, would you do it if it was that same trade, but your 25 or your 2026 first?
That's where it gets harder. Yeah, the more years you go out, the more difficult it is because the more likely that these players aren't going to be the same, and simply the Warriors aren't going to be as good. Thus, the draft pick being a lot better. So
Yeah, I don't think I would give out a first past. I think I would if I'm doing this. I think the most I would give out for either of these trades that I would even like possibly consider is one first, and it would have to be this year's first. When I
I
see
think
Curry
that's
right now,
that's
like that's the most that I would give, or even like consider giving. I'm not actually sure. I can't. I would think about it a little bit more, but I think that's the only thing that's even remotely realistic.
I think yeah, I like you said, I think that's fair and remotely realistic, which is
Yeah.
what we're shooting for, right? Like we're really trying to nail down what these theoretical talent infusions would be with the Warriors.
So if it is Jeremy Grant for Kuminga 2026 first, uh, Buddy Hield, and Guy Santos, what about that? Would you still do it?
Man, the knife, the razor's edge gets just a little bit more narrow as you go out.
I think I would probably, especially because you're probably gonna have to give up a second to the Nets to do this as well. I think I would probably take a half step back on that one. I think with no first, I would do it. With a first, I would probably not do it.
Okay, so then I think we can, I guess, weigh the Brooks and Kuminga trade against each other as well if we're going through it.
Yeah, so if we're doing that one, those ones are pretty much straight up. Brooks for Kuminga or Brooks for Kuminga straight up. I think that one I would probably do. I think that one I feel pretty comfortable with. I think that is enough of an improvement. He fits perfectly on the timeline, and he just is a easier to fit with player and fit with archetype that I think it makes sense. If you're asking me for a first this year, he's 2 years younger, I think I would feel a bit more comfortable giving out the first this year.
Yeah, and these little fake negotiations we're having right now could become very dated very quickly if Kuminga continues to rise. This could be the Warriors asking for picks from these teams, right? So that's very fungible. I think on the grounds of players plus contract, I guess just the fit, right, is what we're really boiling down to. I think both of these players, we agree, you can make a strong argument for being an upgrade over Kuminga in terms of that championship equity percentage increase. But I think we'd both say Brooks has a slight edge over Grant. And then, yeah, there's also the question to round it all out. Does Jonathan Kuminga continue to improve or continue to show what he's shown so far in terms of these improvements? Maybe even a little bit more from a shooting standpoint. We never know. Do the Warriors end up just keeping him after it's all said and done through this trade deadline and beyond?
If you asked me like what I think is going to happen, I think he likely stays on the team for the year. I think at this point it is yeah, I think they'll keep him this trade deadline. I think if the Brooks deal, even with the first, is on the table, the 2026 first, I would do it. I think that is enough of an offensive improvement, and I don't think it really I don't think it pushes back your future rebuild much at all. Like I just don't think this year's pick is going to play into that much.
No.
And
potentially even next year's pick.
Yeah, potentially even next year's. And even then, like if you want to make an even bigger move, you would still have so many assets, so many firsts going forward that I think it would be, you could figure out what you want to figure out with whichever player comes available. So I think most likely what I think is going to happen is he stays on the team through the year and they don't make any big moves with him. I would do the Brooks trade if that was on the table.
I think I come to a similar conclusion, but I think Brooks being a little bit more of a shaky shooter than what you ideally want from that spot, at least in my evaluation, makes me a little bit more hesitant. But I agree. I think they do end up keeping him just because we know NBA trades, there's a lot of friction involved from all parties. Usually the guy staying is the most likely outcome. And yeah, I think we've wrung this towel out about as much as we could. Do you have any other parting thoughts here on the Warriors or Kuminga?
I think there's a lot to learn from this situation. We've joked a lot about how this is kind of getting our PhDs in basketball. And this is how we are trying to become the best evaluators of talent, builders of teams, and we want to, what we're focused on is how do you win NBA championships. I think this is a very interesting situation because there are so many, it's so borderline. And it really comes down to what your philosophy or how much trust you have in what you're trying to do, right? Like
from all from a player development standpoint, from a like you said, basketball philosophy standpoint, from a evaluation standpoint, this situation I think stress tests all of that.
Exactly. And I think the negotiations, if you want to lump that in too, were a really good example of being uncomfortable and how to I think a lot of times it's really easy for teams to kind of just do what keeps all the players happy, and ultimately that can end up hurting the team long term, or at least maybe not long term but medium term, because there is an argument to be made that keeping your players happy is and it kind of builds a
shout out to the Lakers.
Yeah, shout out Lakers, shout out Nuggets. But how you kind of approach this situation of we have a very talented young player who, especially since he has shown kind of some real growth, even if that growth hasn't quite shown up in all of the stats or the box score numbers, like it's very clear when you're watching that something's a little bit different this season. Like he looks
different enough to where us having this conversation is productive and makes sense.
yeah.
Right?
And so your ability to evaluate him, your ability to evaluate all the other, or your ability to evaluate Kuminga, your ability to evaluate all the other options, and then how much do any of those other options increase your championship odds? And like I think with all three of these options of keeping him, trading for Dylan Brooks, trading for Jeremy Grant, the range is so slim that like you could increase your championship odds, but there's a chance that it does nothing. There's a chance that it makes it worse. Like it's such a fine line, and you have to be very aware of how you approach. Like this is the ultimate stress test of your process, and then trusting your process.
Absolutely. Regardless of what decision we would choose here or what the Warriors or Phoenix or Portland's front office would choose here, it puts all of your ideologies about what wins basketball. Like we said, it stress tests it really, really hard because of the margins are so thin. And then also the Warriors, of course, being a really, really important team of the last 15 years plus, and this being the tail end of what has been a really, really fun era from a fan standpoint, but also strategically, tactically, how they push the game forward, and just seeing kind of the final chapter of that play out. I think it's worthwhile to really think about how we could theoretically maximize this if we were the Warriors front office, right? That's more or less what we're doing here.
And on that note, we would like to say thank you for listening. Leave a review. Thank you so much.
Subscribe,
Whatever
like.
it is.